Something happened around 11,000 years ago that almost nobody talks about. While everyone's heard of Stonehenge, of the Romans, of the Normans, the actual first chapter of human life in Britain is this strange, largely forgotten story about people who arrived when the country didn't even exist yet as an island. People who walked here, literally walked here across dry land. That's where I want to start, because I think most of us carry this vague mental image of prehistoric Britain. Cave people huddled in the dark, waiting for something better to come along. The reality is so much more interesting than that, and honestly, a lot stranger too. Let me take you back to a world that's genuinely hard to picture. Around 24,000 years ago, much of northern Europe was buried under ice sheets that stretched for miles in every direction. The landscape that would eventually become Britain was locked under glaciers so massive we can barely imagine them today. Then, starting roughly 14,700 years ago, things began to shift. The climate started warming, not quickly, by human standards agonizingly slowly, but enough that ice began to retreat and plants started pushing their way north through thawing ground. A group of people known to archaeologists as the Magdalenians were already living in what's now southwestern Europe, in the relative warmth of the Iberian Peninsula and the sheltered valleys of southern France. As the ice retreated, they moved north. They followed the herds, followed the vegetation, followed opportunity. Some of them ended up in what is now southern England. And in the Mendip Hills of Somerset, a group of them made use of a cave called Gough's Cave. What happened in that cave is one of the more uncomfortable facts about our earliest predecessors in Britain. The bones found there, both human and animal, tell a story that archaeologists had to sit with for a while before fully accepting. There is clear evidence of cannibalism, not frantic, desperate, survival-driven cannibalism, but something deliberate and practiced. Human skulls were shaped into drinking vessels or bowls. Flesh was stripped from bones in a way that follows the exact same patterns seen when animals were butchered for food. Whether this was ritual, whether it was grief expressed in a way that feels alien to us now, or whether it served some other purpose entirely, we genuinely don't know. But these people were doing something with their dead that was far more complex than simple disposal. Then, the cold came back. About 12,900 years ago, temperatures dropped sharply across the northern hemisphere in a period called the Younger Dryas. Britain became tundra again, open, frozen, windswept, the kind of landscape you'd find today in the far north of Canada or Siberia. And yet the archaeological evidence, thin as it is, suggests some people stayed. Hunters following reindeer herds were apparently present as far north as the Isle of Skye, and possibly even Orkney during these conditions. That's remarkable when you actually think about it. That's the kind of thing that should shake our assumptions about what these people could handle. When the Younger Dryas finally ended, and with it, the entire Pleistocene epoch, the world that emerged was something completely different. The climate stabilized into what we now call the Holocene, and the landscape of northwestern Europe transformed over the following centuries and millennia into something lush and unfamiliar. Birch and pine came first, then hazel, then oak and elm and alder filled in behind. The open tundra gave way to dense, dark forest. The megafauna of the Ice Age were gone. The woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinos, had vanished. In their place came red deer, wild boar, aurochs, beavers, otters, wolves, brown bears, and wild cats. The rivers filled with salmon and trout in numbers that seem almost incomprehensible from where we stand now. And into this new world came new people. Geneticists call them Western hunter-gatherers, WHGs for short. They had roots in southern and southeastern Europe, connected to a culture archaeologists call the Epigravettian. Across thousands of years, they spread throughout Europe, moving into spaces left by or alongside the earlier Magdalenian groups. They were not one uniform population. There were distinct cultures, distinct ways of doing things across different regions, but they shared a common genetic ancestry. And in the Mesolithic period, the people of Britain and Ireland were almost entirely descended from this population. They came in through a place that no longer exists, Doggerland. This is one of those subjects that, once you learn about it, keeps pulling at you. It was a vast lowland stretching across what is now the North Sea, a landscape of rivers, wetlands, hills, and forests connecting Britain to continental Europe. Think of it as an entire country that has since been swallowed by the sea. The Dogger Bank, an area of relatively shallow water in the North Sea that fishermen have worked for centuries, takes its name from this lost land. And for generations, those same fishermen have been pulling up something strange in their nets. Bones of extinct animals, fragments of ancient peat, and occasionally human artifacts. In 1931, a carved bone harpoon was dredged up off the Norfolk coast. It was Mesolithic, exquisitely made, and it came from the sea floor where a landscape had once been. Underwater geological surveys have since mapped the submerged river valleys of Doggerland. We can trace where the rivers ran, where the wetlands spread, where hills rose above floodplain. It was a rich and productive landscape. Red deer and aurochs roamed the open ground. Wild boar rooted in the forest. People hunted along riverbanks, gathered food from wetlands and forest, and moved, generation after generation, across this ground that connected two worlds. But the glaciers were still melting, and the sea level was rising. Year by year, century by century, the sea crept in over the edges of Doggerland. Areas that had been high ground became islands. Lowland forests flooded. Coastlines that one generation knew vanished underwater within a single human lifetime. Sometime around 7,000 years before the Common Era, Britain became an island for good. By around 6,000 years before the Common Era, only one large remnant island remained of what had once been a vast continental territory, Dogger Island, archaeologists call it, and then that too disappeared beneath the waves. There is something genuinely melancholy about this if you sit with it. Imagine watching your homeland shrink. Imagine telling your children about the places your grandparents hunted, and those places being underwater. These were not abstract geological processes happening to no one. These were landscapes that people loved, named, returned to, buried their dead in, and the sea took them. The final blow came suddenly. Around 6,150 years before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened off the coast of Norway. An underwater landslide of enormous scale, the Storegga slide, displaced enough water to generate a tsunami that struck the coasts of what is now northern Britain and Scandinavia. Estimates for wave height range from 5 to 25 meters, depending on local geography. Whatever remained of Doggerland above water was destroyed in hours. The timing appears to have been autumn, which meant that winter food stores and supplies would have been lost along with everything else. Fishing equipment, boats, shelters, swept away or buried under silt. The people who survived would have faced winter with almost nothing. Some researchers believe this disaster lodged itself so deeply in the cultural memory of these communities that they kept their distance from coastal areas for generations afterward. Whether or not that's true, we know that the world left behind was a permanently island Britain, surrounded by sea, cut off from the continent. The people who had once walked here now had to sail. How these people actually lived is something we can piece together, but it requires looking carefully at traces that are often fragmentary. They were not settled farmers. They did not build the kind of permanent architecture that survives thousands of years easily. They moved, following seasons, following food, following a landscape they understood far better than we do. The evidence of their presence is scattered across Britain and Ireland in the form of flint scatters, burned animal bones, and the remains of hearths. Most of what they made was organic: wood, hide, plant fiber, antler, and most of that has long since rotted into nothing. But some things survive, and they are extraordinary. At Mount Sandel in northeastern Ireland, archaeologists found the remains of oval buildings dating to around 8,000 years before the Common Era. At Howick in Northumberland, a large circular structure from around 7,800 years before the Common Era was discovered, and the evidence, the hearth, the post holes, suggests it was used continuously for somewhere between 100 and 300 years. Think about that. A single structure used by people across multiple generations. That is not the behavior of a group with no attachment to place. But the site that changed how we understand Mesolithic Britain more than almost any other is Storegga in North Yorkshire. Around 9,000 years ago, this area was the shore of a shallow lake surrounded by birch and reed forest. The lake eventually silted up and became bog, and the waterlogged conditions preserved organic materials that would normally have rotted away centuries earlier. When archaeologists began excavating and when more recent digs added to the picture, what emerged was extraordinary. Barbed antler points, almost perfectly preserved. A platform of worked timber at the water's edge. The oldest known wooden structure in Britain, and most famously a collection of red deer skulls that had been carefully modified. The cranium hollowed out, holes bored into the bone, the antlers thinned and shaped. They were headdresses. What exactly they were for is a question we genuinely cannot answer with certainty. The most obvious interpretation is camouflage, wearing the head and antlers of a deer to approach live deer without alarming them. But many researchers suspect something more. The wearing of an animal's face, the taking on of its form. This is a feature of shamanic practice in indigenous cultures from Siberia to North America to sub-Saharan Africa. There is something that feels like ritual in these objects, even across 9,000 years of silence. The shell middens of Scotland and Ireland are another kind of evidence, and they are stranger than they might sound. Along ancient coastlines, particularly at sites like the island of Aronsay in the Inner Hebrides, enormous mounds of shellfish remains were accumulated over centuries, sometimes over more than 2,000 years. These are not simply rubbish dumps. Their scale and duration suggest something deliberate. They were landmarks. The gleaming white mounds of shell would have been visible from out at sea. They marked territory. They announced a human presence that stretched back through generations. And within these mounds, archaeologists found human bones. Not complete burials, but fragments. A skull fragment here, some hand bones there. The interpretation that makes most sense is a practice called excarnation, where the body was left exposed until flesh was removed by birds, insects, and weather. The bones were then collected and dealt with in some other way. It is a complex relationship with death, and one that wove together the living, the sea, and the accumulated history of a community's presence on a shoreline. What these people looked like has been a matter of real scientific revision over the past decade or so. For a long time, the assumption, and it was an assumption, not a finding, was that people living in Northern Europe would have evolved pale skin to maximize vitamin D production in low sunlight conditions. Then, ancient DNA analysis began producing results that surprised a lot of people. The genetic markers associated with dark skin pigmentation were present in WHG individuals. The markers for blue or green eyes were also there. So the picture that has emerged is of people with dark to medium brown skin and light-colored eyes, a combination that feels counterintuitive only because we've absorbed the idea that Northern Europeans must have always looked the way they do today. They didn't. The genetic mutations strongly associated with light skin in Europeans appear to have come predominantly from other populations that arrived much later. The most famous Mesolithic person ever found in Britain, Cheddar Man, illustrates all of this. He was discovered in 1903 in Gough's cave in Somerset, the same cave, incidentally, where those modified skulls were found from the earlier Magdalenian period. He died in his early 20s, stood around 5 feet 5 inches tall, and had been deliberately placed in a shallow grave. His skeleton is the most complete Mesolithic human skeleton ever found in Britain, and his face, reconstructed from his skull, looks directly at you from museum displays with an immediacy that is genuinely unsettling in the best possible way. In the 1990s, when his mitochondrial DNA was first analyzed, a local school teacher was found to share the same maternal lineage. The story got enormous media coverage. Cheddar Man's living descendant found still living in the same Somerset town. But the more nuanced reality is that around 80% of WHG individuals shared that same maternal haplogroup, which traces back approximately 30,000 years. The teacher and Cheddar Man share a very distant common ancestor, not a direct line. Still, there is something genuinely striking about the fact that a thread of genetic continuity connects a man who died 9,000 years ago to people walking around today. Between 10 and 20% of people in modern Britain and Ireland carry some WHG ancestry. The intellectual life of these people is, predictably, the hardest thing to reconstruct. We have no written language, no dramatic cave paintings like the ones in Lascaux or Altamira, no monumental sculpture. Early archaeologists interpreted this as evidence of cultural regression, a period of lowered sophistication sandwiched between the striking art of the Paleolithic and the megalithic monuments of the Neolithic. That interpretation now looks badly wrong. At the Nabhead in Pembrokeshire, Wales, over 700 small shale beads were found at a site dating to around 8,400 years before the Common Era. Someone, many people, almost certainly across many years, was making jewelry in this location on what you could only call an industrial scale. What these beads decorated, what they signified, who wore them, we don't know. But the skill and labor involved are obvious. A carved shale object from the same site, depending on the angle from which you look at it, suggests both male and female physical characteristics in the same form. Whether it was sacred, whether it was decorative, whether it was something else entirely, it is not the product of an unsophisticated people. Carr has also yielded engraved objects, geometric patterns carefully cut into bone and antler with a precision that requires real skill and intention. Similar abstract designs appear in Mesolithic sites across Scandinavia and Northern Europe. This is not art that announces itself dramatically. It is art that rewards close attention, and it suggests a shared symbolic vocabulary across a wide geographic area. Two particular discoveries suggest that the Mesolithic people of Britain were doing something with their understanding of the sky that goes well beyond what we typically assume of hunter-gatherer societies. In the 1960s, when a car park was being constructed at Stonehenge, archaeologists found 4 large pits beneath the surface. These pits had once held enormous pine posts, massive timber pillars on a scale comparable to what some indigenous North American cultures would build much later. Radiocarbon dating placed them at around 8,000 years before the Common Era. Stonehenge itself was built roughly 4,000 years later. But the alignment of these posts followed the same east-west axis that Stonehenge would eventually follow. The same spot, the same orientation, 4,000 years apart. And then there is Warren Field in Aberdeenshire. Here, 12 pits arranged in a gentle arc about 50 meters long were discovered. Dating puts them at around 8,000 years before the Common Era. The 12 pits correspond to the 12 months of the lunar year. Their arrangement was calibrated so that at the winter solstice, the rising sun would illuminate the pits from a specific angle, an angle that allowed users of this calendar to correct the accumulated drift between the lunar and solar cycles. This has been described as the oldest calendar ever discovered in the world. Whether or not that specific claim survives future debate, what is not in dispute is that these people were tracking the moon across a complete year, returning to this location over hundreds of years, digging new pits, making corrections. A nomadic group of hunters maintaining a working lunar calendar across multiple generations. That is not the behavior of people who lived only in the present and thought only about the next meal. Their food was varied in ways that reflect the extraordinary richness of their landscape. Red deer, wild boar, and the massive aurochs provided the bulk of meat. Rivers and lakes held salmon and trout and eels in numbers that beggar modern comparison. Coastal communities ate shellfish and crab and opportunistically feasted on beached whales and dolphins when the sea provided. Hazelnuts appear in enormous quantities at virtually every Mesolithic site that has been excavated, charred shells by the thousand. Hazel was not simply gathered. Evidence strongly suggests that Mesolithic people burned sections of woodland specifically to encourage hazel growth, knowing the years following a burn would produce heavier nut crops. This is where the picture of Mesolithic people as passive wanderers most completely breaks down. They managed their landscape. They burned forest clearings to create grazing areas that would attract deer, making hunting more predictable. They transported animals to Ireland, an island that lacked red deer, wild boar, and brown bears, because it had been separated from Britain before those species had the chance to cross naturally. The only way those animals could have arrived in Ireland during the Mesolithic is if people carried them there, alive, across the open water of the Irish Sea in skin boats. That is an extraordinary undertaking. It required boats capable of open water crossings. It required capturing and keeping large wild animals alive during the journey. And most significantly, it required long-term strategic thinking about future food availability. Precisely the kind of planning we don't usually attribute to pre-agricultural societies, but perhaps should. The tools these people used were remarkable for reasons different from the large hand axes of earlier periods. The signature Mesolithic technology is the microlith, a tiny, precisely shaped flint blade designed to be set into a composite weapon. A single spear or arrow would have multiple microliths hafted along its shaft using tree resin, creating a cutting or piercing edge that could be repaired in the field by replacing individual blades rather than discarding the whole weapon. It is a modular system. It is repairable and adaptable. It is not the technology of people who hadn't thought carefully about efficiency and practicality in the field. What eventually ended this world was not the sea, and not the cold, and not any natural catastrophe. It was other people. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, Neolithic farmers began arriving in Britain from continental Europe. They brought cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, wheat, and barley. They brought pottery. They built rectangular longhouses and cleared forests for fields in a way that permanently altered the landscape. They were doing something fundamentally different from anything that had come before in these islands. The ancient DNA evidence is blunt about what happened next. In Neolithic British genomes, the genetic contribution from WHG people, from the Mesolithic inhabitants, is minimal. That tells us this was not a gradual cultural conversion. The Mesolithic people of Britain were not slowly taught to farm by their neighbors. They were displaced. The mechanisms were almost certainly multiple: direct conflict, the disruption of hunting territories, and almost certainly epidemic disease. Farming communities carry a wide range of illnesses passed between domesticated animals and humans. A population that had never encountered those pathogens would have had no immunity, and the mortality could have been catastrophic. There are glimpses of contact between the two populations. At Ferreter's Cove in Ireland, bones of domesticated cattle were found in a Mesolithic context, dating to around 4,350 years before the Common Era. Ireland had no wild cattle. Those bones got there somehow, through trade, through theft, through some form of contact across a cultural boundary. But moments like this were the exception. The broader pattern was replacement at a scale that is genuinely uncomfortable to contemplate. Some WHG individuals may have been absorbed into Neolithic communities in southeastern England. In the remote islands of Scotland, the last Mesolithic communities may have held on for a few more centuries. But within a few hundred years of the Neolithic arrival, the way of life that had persisted for thousands of years was gone, except that it was never entirely gone. The Neolithic farmers who replaced the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers carried some WHG ancestry themselves, absorbed into farming communities on the continent before they ever crossed to Britain. One Neolithic Irish sample showed 42% WHG ancestry. When the Belbeca people arrived around 2,400 years before the Common Era, they too brought some WHG genetics with them, filtered through continental populations who had partly descended from Mesolithic ancestors. Somewhere between 10 and 20% of the DNA of modern British and Irish people traces back to those original hunter-gatherers, to the people who walked across Doggerland, who wore deer skull headdresses at the edge of a lake in Yorkshire, who built a lunar calendar in Aberdeenshire, who carried live boar across the Irish Sea in skin boats because they were thinking about what their descendants would eat. Some part of what they were is still here.